So imagine you're riding in the car with friends, and you're scrolling through older like radio stations because your buddy lost his aux cord. And when you reach the station, you finally hear this. Alright, so pretty straightforward right away. Most people know exactly who the band is. It's a band that defined an entire decade, and it's one whose legacy will endure for the test of time. Today I'll be talking about the legacy of one of my favorite bands, Nirvana, because of their impact on music, and I'll be highlighting their rise, their beginnings, a couple of their albums, and a very emotional live performance that will be one of their last. So, early beginnings, Kurt Cobain, the lead singer, met Chris Novoselic in Aberdeen, Washington, which, against popular opinion, is 100 miles away from Seattle, which is where people mostly believe the band was originally formed at. But it was 100 miles away, and the duo, when they started band hopping from band to band, picking up different gigs, just trying to get out there, get exposed to the music scene. And it wasn't until they met Aaron Burkhart about a couple years later after band hopping that they formed the original trio of Nirvana. Rise to prominence, their first gigs, they started super bluegrass way of gaining recognition. They played backyard party gigs and just rocked houses down to the ground. And their momentum of the parties and their folk group following got the recognition of Sub Pop Records, who is an indie label, which is for less known music that's kind of just new and just kind of starting to emerge as popular culture. And through that record label, they recorded 10 demos and put together their first album, Bleach, which in total cost only $600 to produce, which is very, very cheap for a record to be produced. It sounds kind of cheap in its recording, but it only fueled the artistic style of grunge even more to kind of a garagey feel, is what musicians call it. And the album would go on to sell 35,000 copies, which in large aspect for initial sales isn't huge, but it put them on the map and got them airtime on college radios and also got them a little bit of traction in the UK. Through that album, Bleach, they caught the attention of EGC Records, which is actually a major record label. And through this, they recorded their second studio album, Nevermind. And before the album was released, on MTV, they aired the Smells Like Teen Spirit music video, which is the song I played earlier. And through that music video being released before the album, it only propelled the sales further. They sold out their 50,000 initial supply of albums, which just shows how much the album shattered expectations. And other tracks that carried the album through were Polly, In Bloom, and Come As You Are. And this album is described in one of the articles that I read as changing rock from what was before to everything that came after. After the success of their third album, In Utero, the band would go on to play a live show on MTV's Unplugged TV show. This was 4 months before the band had dismembered, and it is seen as one of the greatest live performances of all time, and also as a little emotional farewell by Kurt Cobain. It was an all-acoustic show, hence the title of the show, Unplugged, like unplugged from an amp. And Cobain intended the crew to set up the studio as a funeral. So you see there's it's kind of hard to see the picture at the moment, but there's lilies all around, common funeral flower, just a mood lighting, candles all around. And it's just kind of a very somber kind of look to the whole concert. But if you ever listen to the album that was put out with it, it's very clear to see how emotionally distraught and depressed Kurt Cobain is at the time, just because of he goes on yelling rants in his songs that are somewhat harmonic in a way as well. And he just truly engages his audience through his performance. And this would come 4 months before his eventual death. on April 5th, 1994. He committed suicide by using a shotgun on himself at his home in Seattle, Washington. And a suicide note was left behind to his wife and daughter right here. It says, "Keep going, Courtney," who was Courtney Love, his wife. For Frances, for her life is going to be much better without mine in it. And it was a very great loss to the music world. Very, not just to Nirvana fans, but to music fans alike. One celebrity even was quoted by saying that his death was equivalent to that of John Lennon's in the 1980s to the young adult population. And the band would, without a frontman, would go on to dismember. Dave Grohl would go on to form the Foo Fighters, and not much was heard from their bassist at the time. So overall, Nirvana had left a very great impact on not just grunge music or the 90s, but I think in music as a total by taking so many influences together and putting them into one just harmonic sense of rage and angst. And even though their longevity and career was cut short, I do believe that their legacy will endure a lifetime. Thank you.
Good Zoom night. So Jay, what did you think? He's not here? He signed in? Okay. That's 5 points down the tubes. Tanner, I like the visualization at the beginning of the speech of driving down the road with your friends, hearing the song. I thought that it worked pretty well. You finally got the song going at maybe a second or so slower than I would have thought would have worked, but it came across pretty effectively, and I thought it was a creative way to kind of pull us in. The subject is clearly identified. You've got a pretty straightforward goal. It's kind of a review of the legacy, like you said, the legacy of the band. That's fine. It's going to be chronological in nature, but I don't know what the stopping points along the way are going to be. So although there is a preview, it's really a very generic kind of thing about, we're going to kind of go through their legacy here. And I think that you have particular points that you could emphasize a little bit more as the stopping points. I mean, you do it in the body of the speech, so I'm not sure why it's not as clear at the beginning. Supporting materials, I didn't hear a source for most of the history information. There was a couple of citations about people talking about their work or about the impact that they had, but for everything else, I don't know where that came from. So you need to provide a little bit of information so that we know that you aren't just making this up. I don't think you're making it up. I mean, I'm familiar with some of it, but you need to demonstrate it to the audience that you're talking to here. The transitions are mostly helped by the visuals. You've got a lot of structure in those visuals. That's basically, bullet points with a visual to remind us what the next point is. So it's perfectly satisfactory. It creates the ability to recall things and kind of structures things. It doesn't add much to our understanding of what's going on. At the end, when you do have the suicide note, I think there is probably an emotional element to that could, I don't want to say be milked, but it could certainly be developed a little bit more to give us a reaction to what you're talking about that's a little bit stronger, especially with those words about how he thinks his life or his daughter's life is going to be better without him in it. I think that that's one of those things that would pull at most people's heartstrings and make them care a little bit more about what's going on and how depressed or tragic he might have felt. I know that you mentioned some of the performance in the MTV concert as reflecting some of his problems and issues going on there. That seems like maybe there would be a clip or two that you could use. I don't know what the availability is on those kinds of things. I would assume since it's available for home video that you could probably access that in some way. That might have been a nice add. As it was, the visual materials just seemed very basic. You know, they structure stuff, they kind of make a transition for things, but they don't add too much to the understanding. I did think it was a little bit strange that his friend that he went from band to band with and formed Nirvana with disappears from your story, and at the end it's like he's barely a footnote. The Dave Grohl's in the band. You wouldn't know that until the end of the speech when you mentioned that the band, and I apologize, this probably sounds picayune, dismembers, that means that they cut each other up. All right? They disbanded. You know, I knew that was the word that you wanted to use, but you said dismember and it was up there on the screen. I'm going, yeah, that sounds like a horror film. You know, the band dismembered themselves, and I'm going, oh yeah, I'd like to see that. That's not going to go good. And we're not emphasizing the delivery things a huge amount. I thought you did a good job speaking to the audience and looking at us. That's pretty good. I'm going to beat you. Get the gum out of your mouth while you're giving the speech. It is really distracting. All right, and you know we haven't talked about it, so I can't legitimately beat you. Next time I will hit you. Okay? And you know I'm mostly joking. Okay, so anybody who's listening to this later on, I'm mostly joking. All right.